Hello and good evening. Welcome to the Barbados Association of Professional Engineers monthly technical webinar for June 2022. This is a CPD event, that is, Continuous Professional Development Event, and carries a value of 2 CPD points. Please contact our Secretariat to have your CPD information forwarded to you should you wish to claim those points for your professional designation. So, a bit of housekeeping rules for this afternoon. Please note that these sessions will be, our session is run as follows. We will have our presenter. We will do an introduction for our presenter, and he will do his presentation for between 30 to 40 minutes. We will then open our session to ask general interaction for you, the listening audience, to be able to ask questions and interact with our guests. This can be done either by raising your hand, at which time I will acknowledge you and invite you to answer your question in person. Alternatively, you can post your question in the chat and I will answer the question on your behalf. We ask that you please mute your electronic devices unless you're asking a question. Tonight's topic will be the movement of services and rights of establishment under the CSME. So just to give you an idea of who will be doing the presentation tonight, and we will be presented to by Mr. Leo Titus Preville, and he is the Program Manager of Caricom Single Market at the Caricom Single Market and Economy Unit, which is based here in Barbados. He started his role in September 2020, having before served as a permanent secretary in the government of St. Lucia for over 12 years, most of that time as permanent secretary in the ministry responsible for trade, industry, and commerce, and consumer affairs. During that period, he also served as permanent secretary in the Ministry of Tourism and Civil Aviation, as well as permanent secretary in the Department of Labor. So you can see Mr. Preville is well versed in the subject matter that he will be presenting on this evening. Mr. Preville has also served as Director of Economics and Research at the St. Lucia Air and Seaports Authority, Director of Commerce and Industry in the Government of St. Lucia, and as a Senior Economist in the Ministry of Economic Planning. He was also Chief Information Officer in the Government Information Service for St. Lucia between 1990 and 1995. He has served on numerous boards, including that of LEAT, Caribbean Export, Invest St. Lucia, as well as Export St. Lucia, the export promotion agency of St. Lucia. He was a tutor with the University of the West Indies through the UWI Open Campus for over 10 years, where he tutored Introduction to Micro and Macroeconomics, Quantitative Methods, Managerial Economics, and Financial Management. Mr. Preville holds a postgraduate diploma in mass communication from the University of the West Indies, a degree in economics and management, as well as a master's degree in economics from the UWI. Just to give you a little snapshot, in case you were not aware about Caricom, it's that wonderful thing that all of our countries are a part of. So this is taken from the Caricom's website, and I'll just read some information here verbatim before we get going on our topic. And this is titled Pillars of Integration. It says, functional cooperation in various conceptions has always been a quest for countries of the Caribbean. From the early efforts for a political union, which led to the establishment of the West Indies Federation in 1958, to the deeper and more structured engagements of the Caribbean Free Trade Association, CARIFTA, in 1965, to the more sustained measures of the regional integration through a Caribbean community in 1973. The last for member states offered the best prospect for Caribbean economic development. Caricom came into being on the 4th of July, 1973, with the signing of the Treaty of Chaguaramas by Prime Ministers Errol Barrow for Barbados, Forbes Burnham for Guyana, Michael Manley for Jamaica, and Eric Williams for Trinidad and Tobago. The treaty was later revised in 2002 to allow for the eventual establishment of a single market and a single economy. Caricom rests on 4 main pillars, that of economic integration, foreign policy coordination, human and social development, and security. These pillars underpin the stated objectives of our community. And what is CARICOM, some of you may ask? CARICOM, the Caribbean Community, is a grouping of 20 countries, 15 member states, and 5 associate members. It is home to approximately 16 million citizens, 60% of whom are under the age of 30, and from the main ethnic groups of indigenous peoples: Africans, Indians, Europeans, Chinese, Portuguese, and Javanese. The community is multilingual with English as the major language, complemented by French and Dutch, and variations of these, as well as African and Asian expressions. So I've sought to give you a snapshot on what CARICOM is, what the pillars of integration are, and we're now going to invite our speaker, Mr. Titus Preville, to enlighten us a bit on how we all can move freely throughout this region and practice as professionals. So Mr. Titus Preville, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Vincent, and for this warm introduction. And you've done a good job for me, taking away some of what I would have had to say in terms of the introduction of CARICOM itself. So I want to thank you for that, which would allow me to go perhaps straight into the core of my presentation this evening. I have a PowerPoint presentation, which I am going to share with our audience this evening. And it's not too lengthy, I hope, which would allow us to go through and have some good discussion at the end of the exercise. So Vincent would have indicated in his, so I think you should see my screen right now. It says here, the right of establishment and provision of services in the CSME. He would have given you a sense that of the composition of CARICOM, and very important to note that of the 15 member states, Bahamas, while a member of CARICOM, is not a member of the CSME at the moment. So Bahamas does not participate in the CSME, and Montserrat participates in some aspects of the CSME. So as such, the areas that we will speak to this evening will not deal with or treat with Bahamas. And if one were to move to Bahamas to establish a business or provide the services, it would be in terms or under conditions as determined by Bahamas, and not necessarily as obtains within the single economic space or the single market of CARICOM. So as we get into the meat of the matter, you would recall that Vincent would have pointed out that the CSME, in terms of the revised treaty, the signing was done in 2001. And essentially, two of the key principles or fundamental principles of the CSME rest in Articles 8, Article 7, and Article 8 of the treaty. And here we talk about matters pertaining to non-discrimination. And under non-discrimination, we speak to what we call national treatment and most favored nation treatment. And that underpins how service providers or any entity moving to establish a business has to be treated when you move from one member state to another. Now, because of those fundamental principles of non-discrimination, it was important for us to, or for the region, to have undertaken an exercise of the removal of discriminatory legislation, administrative practices and procedures before we could have fully engaged in the CSME. And so between 2001 and 2006, there was an extensive program for the removal of restrictions. And these restrictions, I said, would have been in the form of legislation which would have discriminated against the principle of national treatment. And essentially, national treatment means that there can be no differentiation in treatment of community nationals on the basis of nationality. So a St. Lucian moving to Barbados to establish a business should be treated in the same manner as a Bajan establishing the very same type of business in Barbados. And the principle of most favored nation treatment tells us that any member of Caricom cannot treat another member, or should I say any member of the CSME, should not treat another member in any way which is preferential to a third member within the region. So whatever we offer as one member state to another member state is automatically offered to all members within the CSME. And also, as members of the CSME, we cannot offer conditions for establishing businesses or providing services. We cannot offer conditions more favorable to a third country, meaning a non-CARICOM country, than we would offer to a fellow CARICOM country. So these are some of the fundamental principles I thought we needed to get out of the way very early as we look at the whole area of free movement of to provide services and to establish businesses. Now, the core regimes of the CSME are basically 5. To have a single market in a CSME construct, it envisages the free movement of goods, the free movement of capital, the free movement of services, the free movement of skills, and the right to establish businesses in the community. Now, when we think of community nationals moving, they move primarily on the 3 of the regimes. Primarily we see, there is movement otherwise, but primarily on the 3 of the regimes. That is the movement of skills, the right of establishment regime, and the movement of services. Services and right of establishment. When we speak of services, we speak of the freedom of movement of persons to deliver services on a temporary basis. It's very important to note that word, temporary basis. And this is juxtaposed against the other measure, which is establishment. Now, CARICOM nationals can incorporate or register a business or an enterprise anywhere in the community. However, as we speak, the challenge remains the lack of harmonization of procedures. And as we speak, work is currently being done to treat with this anomaly or with the variation in procedures within the community. And that work is being done through some consultancy, which is aimed at harmonizing our legislation and our business names registration and treating with matters of insolvency. Now, tonight, the members of the Barbados Association of Professional Engineers have asked the Secretariat to speak on the matter of provision of services and establishing businesses. So once you think of that, you think of an environment that provides or should provide a certain degree of certainty as you move about to provide services or establish a business. And therefore, certainty generally finds itself in provisions of law. And within the scope of our CSME, the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas establishes the legal framework on which everything else is built. So with respect to the provision of services, we see this addressed in detail in Articles 36 and 37 of the revised treaty. In fact, in Article 36, Section 4, it speaks to services as services provided against remuneration other than wages in an approved sector, and the provision of services is through 4 modes of supply. Important to note, there is a distinction between remuneration for wages as opposed to remuneration for services provided in the following 4 modes. The first mode, which is what we call in the trade language cross-border supply, and that is simply a service being supplied from one member state to another member state, generally through electronic means. Then we have what we refer to as consumption abroad. And in this particular mode of supply, a consumer from a member state A moves to another member state B, and while in member state B, they consume services. A typical example for that would be tourism. And then we have the third mode of providing services, which is through the establishment of a commercial presence. And fourthly, we have the movement, the temporary movement of natural persons from one member state to another to provide services. So this gives you a picture of the four ways, the four modes in which a service is generally supplied. Under the treaty, we look at what are the rights that a person has as they exercise the right of provision of services or the right of establishment. A Caricom national has the right to enter and receive a definite stay of no less than 6 months when one moves to provide a service or establish a business. And this is also applicable to that principal mover's spouse or any dependents that that principal mover has. That principal mover also has the right to stay and work for the period of the contract without a work permit. So for someone moving to provide a service, in the context of our arrangement, it is understood that that person would be moving to provide a service in the context of a relationship perhaps with another party. And that relationship is generally through some form of contractual arrangement. And so the person moving to establish that, to provide that service, would have the right to stay in the receiving member state for the period of the contract to provide that service. And that, of course, depends when the person has arrived, and we will see some of the procedural elements a little later in the presentation. Now, when a principal mover has moved and has moved also with his spouse or her spouse, that spouse would also have the right to work without a work permit. And that's very important, to work without a work permit. When we continue to look at the rights under Articles 36 and 37, we see here that the right of that principal mover, he also has the right to move personnel and their spouses and dependents. So these persons who would move to assist the principal mover who is providing that service. So to assist the principal mover in providing that service, he will sometimes have to move some of his staff with him. So that staff or these staff will also have the right to stay and work without a work permit while employed with the principal service provider. Also, the principal service provider and his or her personnel have the right to receive an extension of stay to complete the service that was intended. Because from time to time, you may have a person moving to provide a service, and through no fault of theirs or through other arrangements in the scope of work, there needs to be an extension of stay. And that is a right also that ought to be extended to the service provider. Now, we've mentioned in the discussion so far, in the presentation so far, we've mentioned that when a principal mover has moved, he or she may also have moving with him his spouse and also support staff. And these support staff would have their own dependents with them as well as the principal mover. So Article 239 of the revised treaty is an article which speaks to the built-in agenda of the treaty. And the built-in agenda is meant to address work that has not yet been completed, but would be undertaken in time during the life of as we further develop our arrangements. And under the protocol, under the Article 239, there is the provision for the elaboration of a protocol on contingent rights. That protocol has been signed by all member states and provisionally applied by some member states. So the protocol on contingent rights addresses rights contingent on that of the principal mover. And those rights would include rights such as the right of the principal mover's children to be entitled to education, entitled to healthcare in the receiving member state, and so forth. So the protocol on contingent rights has a number of articles, and one of the critical articles in that protocol, that is Article 3, has to be itself further elaborated so that we could have a regime that gives even greater certainty to dependents or persons who move contingent on the principal mover. Also included in the protocol on contingent rights is the arrangement, which is still being developed, to allow for the movement of the tools of trade of a principal mover. So tonight, for the purpose of our discussion, we have engineers. And so an engineer moving to provide a service in another member state, mechanical engineer, electrical engineer, whatever, you may have some of the tools of your trade that you need to move with you as you move to provide that service. So under the protocol on contingent rights, it is important that we complete the elaboration of the regime in that regard, so that when a member of the community or community national is moving to provide services, that this person is not, this person does not face the rigors at the border where they're being asked to pay duties and taxes on goods on which they have already paid in the member state from which they were coming from. So you're looking at a regime that is meant to facilitate the movement of tools of trade of a principal mover moving to provide a service, a Caricom national moving to provide a service in the community. Earlier on, I said there are a number of administrative arrangements we need to understand to facilitate that principal mover. So we have, from the position of a principal mover, a Caricom national wanting to leave his home state to move to another state to provide a service. What is required? That Caricom national needs to, from his home state, show proof of the Caricom nationality by virtue of the passport. They should also present proof of the role or their role as a service provider. Because what is meant under these administrative requirements is to ensure that when this engineer is leaving his home state to provide a service in another member state, he is moving with all the relevant information and documentation to facilitate an easy entry into the receiving state. So that engineer moving from his home state should ensure that he has or she has with her the letter from the relevant association or body in his home country, which certifies him or her as being who he or she says he is, an engineer. So it is important to in facilitating or in taking advantage of the arrangements in the community to allow for the provision of services, and tonight we're speaking in terms of engineers, that engineers have with them, apart from the contract to provide the service in the member state they're moving to, they ought to have some form of documentation which supports their position or their status as an engineer from their home state. So in moving, you ought to have your national, your passport clearly. And in addition to your passport, which allows you entry into the receiving country, you should ensure that you have all other relevant information, as we have in the presentation here, to allow for ease of entry. The receiving state. On entry on this Caricom national arriving to provide that service in the receiving member state, the receiving member state, the Caricom services provider should possess, upon arrival, the valid Caricom passport to signify that they are Caricom national, the services certificate or letter or information from the relevant authority. In this case, if it's Barbados, it's the Barbados Association of Professional Engineers, a letter from that authority indicating that this person is a bona fide engineer, and also the contract or letter of invitation that the person has from the receiving country to provide that service to the person who they're going to provide that service to, or the entity they'll provide that service to. Also, on entry, the service provider personnel, meaning if the principal mover has staff who they are going to move with to support in the provision of the services, the personnel should also possess the valid passport from a Caricom member country, the contract for the provision of the service, and the contract of employment with the principal service provider. And once those documentation in order, the principal service provider as well as the support personnel should receive on entry a stamp of no less than 6 months. I say no less than 6 months because automatically any Caricom national moving from one member state to another should automatically receive 6 months upon arrival, whether the person is moving to provide for the purpose of economic engagement or for the purpose of leisure. That person ought to be receiving a minimum of 6 months. In the case of a service provider moving, that time frame would be dependent on the length of the contract that the person is moving to provide the service for. Now, anytime a Caricom national is moving to provide the service, as in this case, and the person has the necessary documentation, that person should not, under any circumstance, be asked to have a work permit or to work with a work permit. A work permit is not required in a situation such as this. So we've looked at the conditions from the member state, the home state, and the requirements in the receiving state as it pertains to a Caricom national moving to provide a service. When that Caricom national is moving to establish a commercial presence, which is the third mode of supply we saw earlier, the following provides us with the legal framework within which that Caricom national is going to exercise his rights. Articles 32 and 33 of the revised treaty. And I encourage everyone, every member of the Barbados Association of Professional Engineers and all other persons who might be listening and following this discussion, I encourage you all to have a copy of your revised treaty. And the revised treaty is online, can be downloaded. And this should be part of every household library of literature, because it is our right. These are our rights in there. So Articles 32 and 33. According to Article 32.3, the right of establishment includes the right to engage in any non-wage earning activity of a commercial, industrial, agricultural, or artisanal nature. So the right to engage in non-wage earning activities. If one moves in a wage earning activity, one is no longer presenting himself as an entity that is establishing a business. One is moving as a wage earner, which is a different category. Secondly, Article 32.3 indicates to us that establishment also involves the ability to create and manage economic enterprises. So your ability to create and manage economic enterprises is also part of what is envisaged in the right of establishment. Caricom nationals have a right to establish a commercial presence in another member state, and that commercial presence must be lawful, meaning it must be consistent with the laws of the country. It must be for profit. And very importantly, it may not include activities that involve the exercise of a governmental function or where there is a monopoly. So what are the rights we have under Articles 32 and 33? You have the right to enter and receive a definite stay of 6 months, and that is also applicable to the spouse and dependents of that person who is moving to establish that business. You have a right to operate the business without a work permit. You have a right to indefinite stay, And this is also applicable to your spouse and dependents once you have completed some of the procedural requirements, which I'll speak to later. You have the right or the right of your spouse to work without a work permit, and the right to move your managerial, technical, and supervisory staff and their spouses and dependents to assist in the establishment and management of the commercial activity that you have established in that receiving member state. Also, you have the right for your managerial, technical, and supervisory staff to work without a work permit. So if you think through it, pretty much everything or every right that a principal mover, someone who is moving to establish a commercial presence, would have in a receiving member state, their staff, their managerial, technical, and supervisory staff would have the very same rights that the principal mover would have had. You have the right to indefinite stay. You have the right to receive a written reason for the decision from the relevant authority, and you also have the right to consult with an attorney or a consular officer, and the right to judicial review where there is a decision of the relevant authority not to grant you those rights. So where you have been denied your right in any way, there is the option available to every Caricom national in the exercise of the right of establishment. Where you have that right being denied for some reason, you have recourse in terms of judicial review, recourse in terms of seeking a written reason from the relevant authority as to why you are not able to exercise that right. Now, like all things in the execution of rights, there will be some limitations. And again, if you go back to your treaty, the rights or the limitations on the ability of a Caricom national to either provide a service or establish a business, these limitations are very strict, and they are found in Article 43. And one of those, and Article 43 speaks to a situation where a member state is exercising the right to deny, as it were, a mover from establishing a commercial presence or providing a service. One of the bases on which that could be exercised is where there is a situation of balance of payments problems occurring. So to safeguard balance of payments, that's one of the legitimate limitations. To resolve economic difficulties or hardships. Essentially, Article 47 speaks to where there is a situation where a receiving member state, as a result of the exercise by Caricom nationals of their rights under the treaty, where a receiving member state finds itself in a situation that it is facing economic difficulty or hardships in a particular sector or sectors, it has the right to restrict or impose a limitation on other Caricom nationals as they seek to exercise their rights. And also we have Article 2 to 5 of the treaty, which speaks to security exemptions. And of course, that is understandable. Member states may deny a Caricom national the right to establish or provide a service if the member state has credible enough reason to believe that that person would pose a security threat to that member state, the receiving member state. Very important, member states have the right to non-disclosure and also the right to take action to maintain international peace and security. So these are all reasons or bases on which a member state could exercise a right to limit what would normally be the right of a Caricom national to provide a service or establish a commercial presence. Article 2 to 6, under the general exceptions regime of the treaty, also provides situations or conditions under which the limitation could be exercised by a receiving member state. And that is if the member state believes that the Caricom national moving would be a threat to public morals. So protection of public morals or maintenance of public order and safety is a valid basis. Protection of human, animal, and plant life or health is another basis. Secure compliance with laws meaning that if the mover is moving in a manner that is not compliant with laws of the receiving member state, or moving in a manner not consistent with the treaty, that is a basis for limitation. Very importantly, a member state cannot use as a cover the imposition of measures that are arbitrary, discriminatory, or used as a disguise to restrict trade between member states. And then it's very interesting to look at the treaty in that regard, because when you look at Article 32 of the treaty, you see that the treaty speaks to member states committing not to impose any new restriction in the individual territories on the right of Caricom nationals to provide a service. So essentially, after we went through the program of removal of restrictions that ended in 2006, one of the fundamental understandings is, and it is in the treaty, is that member states cannot unilaterally impose any new limitations or rights on Caricom nationals who seek to exercise their rights to provide a service or establish a business. There must be sound reason, and those exceptions I just went through a short while ago. And if a member state were to exercise those general exceptions, as we see in Article 226, these must be brought to the attention of the various organs of the community and institutions. So the Council for Trade and Economic Development, the Council for Human and Social Development, that's the COSOD. These are, and of course, the CCJ, these are all institutions that are meant, and they are enshrined in the treaty to serve as safeguards, so that if a member state were to impose a particular measure that would restrict trade, and the member state believes that it needs to institute that measure because a particular sector of its economy is suffering as a result of the CSME, then that member state needs to notify the quoted of that measure, should ideally do it in advance. And very importantly, it must state the length of time that measure will be in place. And in fact, the quoted is the one to decide how long that measure should be in place. So all such measures should be temporary in nature. Very importantly, that those limitations must stick to the strict and narrow construction that is under the exceptions in the treaty. Now, the right to indefinite stay is also limited to operation of a business or employment with the business. So indefinite stay is limited to the business, the duration for which the entity, if one was moving to provide a service, the stay would be, of course, not indefinite because it would have been time bound. But if one were to move to establish a commercial presence, then the indefinite stay is tied to the continuity of that commercial presence. And that would apply to the staff who moved, to the technical or supervisory staff who moved and who would have been enjoying indefinite stay also. So in terms of administrative procedures and requirements, a Caricom national must seek to enter on a passport issued by a Caricom member state who is a party to the revised treaty. And upon entry, this Caricom national would automatically receive a stamp of 6 months. And once the Caricom national qualifies in terms of if the Caricom national is moving to establish a commercial presence and has gone through the process of convincing or indicating to the member state, the receiving member state, that they do qualify to establish a commercial presence, then that Caricom nationals will have in his passport or her passport a stamp that says indefinite stay and permission to, well, not permission to work, just indefinite stay. So in terms of procedures, to establish a business, an engineer moving to establish a commercial presence needs to register a company or a business name in the receiving member state or incorporate in the receiving member state. Registration, register the business is done if you have already incorporated, or if you were incorporated in a member state already. Companies don't incorporate twice. So if you're moving, you register your business. Now, this is where we were speaking to arrangements that are currently being undertaken within the community through the CSME unit in particular, to look at the establishment of certain tools to allow for easier incorporation and registration of businesses and business names. So we're looking at harmonization of our legislation to allow for easier incorporation and registration of businesses and the business names. So in terms of procedural requirements for recognition of the right, the Caricom National moving to establish that business should have evidence of their incorporation or registration in the receiving member state, should have the police certificate of character, and should have supporting documentation. So you're moving to establish a commercial presence. Typically, you would have to undertake what is normally undertaken by a national in that member state. You are moving, therefore, you would have to get in contact with the relevant authority, the Ministry of Commerce, the Ministry of Trade, the Ministry of Business Development, so that that ministry could go through that business that you intend to establish. So you're going to be establishing a business. You should have a business plan. You should have something to indicate that that business is something that is viable. And so as a result of you having presented that information, meaning the viability of that business, at least the plan, and the other information captured here, that receiving competent authority will issue a letter to you. You should also be moving to, as you would issue the receiving member state competent authority will issue a letter to you, which they would copy to the immigration department, and that will allow for the regularization of your immigration status, meaning moving you to an indefinite stay status. So what are the obligations of the Caricom National in terms of the right of establishment? We've been looking at the obligations or the rights of Caricom National. But what are your obligations? The Caricom National moving to establish a commercial presence should be able to ensure that they register the business entity or business name or incorporate their business. That Caricom National should be truthful at all times with the relevant authorities and to obey the laws of the receiving country, including, once that entity has been established, the payment of all relevant taxes. So that is critical, payment of all relevant taxes, because you are now part of the commercial body of that receiving state. Very important, you need to provide the relevant documentation in terms of originals or certified copies where they are applicable to the relevant authorities of all documentation required for the application for the right to establish a business, police record, certificate of incorporation, etc. What we just identified earlier. In terms of the receiving member state, what are the rights? They have the right to be able to assess whether the Caricom National or the Caricom entrepreneur is genuinely seeking to start up a business in that receiving state. They have the right to be able to deny or revoke the right of definite entry or indefinite entry of the Caricom National, his or her spouse or dependents or staff, in order to protect public morals, maintain public order and safety, or protect human life or animal life. And that we would have seen under the list of limitations that we spoke to earlier. And of course, the receiving member state has the right to full disclosure from the applicant or the person moving to establish. They also have the right to be able to rescind indefinite stay if the business is no longer viable or operational in the receiving state, and to be able to rescind the indefinite stay of any managerial, technical, and supervisory staff brought in by the Caricom entrepreneur or principal mover on the basis of the right of establishment, if that business is no longer viable, or if that member of staff is no longer employed by that Caricom national who established the commercial presence. So what are some of the emerging initiatives that we see impacting the provision of services in the CSME? As we speak, there is work being done, and this work is being spearheaded by my colleague over at the services unit within Caricom, and that is with respect to a regional registration or a regional registration system for professional services. So we have identified, that is the Secretariat working with member states, have identified, and these have been approved by the heads of 11 professional services that we're seeking to have established a process for registration. And in fact, tonight, one of the things we would want to get from you in terms of the reaction very soon is your reaction to the idea of a regional system for the registration of professional engineers. And related to that, your feedback on the possibility of the establishment of licensing systems for, in this case, I will speak to engineers. How do you see a regime that would address the licensing of professional engineers throughout the community? That I just want to put that on your mind for a short while, as we will engage in the discussion shortly. Also, the services unit within the Caricom Secretariat is in the process of rolling out programs to implement the regional strategic plan for professional services. And professional services is one of the categories under the WTO structure of services. And within professional services, we'd have a number of subgroupings, which would include engineers, accountants, and so forth. So this is an area that we are now beginning to roll out in terms of seeing how best can we facilitate the movement of professional services and providers in the community. And here we're thinking of systems of common registration or harmonized registration for a particular professional service sector, as well as licensing. We wanted to also draw to your attention that, and I have not placed that in a slide, but in terms of emerging initiatives, that the Caricom Secretariat has undertaken over the years the establishment of a number of online systems. And one of them is the online companies registry system, which is meant to allow the various member states to upload or to provide when they would have registered companies and those business names would have been taken in a particular member state. We wanted to find a way through the online companies registry system of providing that information in one place so that a person in another member state would be able to go online and see the business names or the businesses that are registered or incorporated in another member state. And if they're thinking of establishing a business in that country, then they would see the names that have already been taken. They would see the businesses that are there and perhaps use that as a platform or basis to go into joint venture arrangements and so forth. So we've established an online company registry system, which is going to be redeveloped. We have a Caricom application processing system, which is meant to facilitate movement of skilled Caricom nationals. And skilled Caricom nationals are Caricom nationals who have met the criteria, either as university graduates, musicians, sports persons. You know, there are 12 such categories, including nurses and teachers and so forth. So we have those categories, those 12 categories. And when these categories are moving, we're just in the process of redesigning a Caricom application processing system, which would be an online system where persons would be able to apply to get the skill certificates processed and verified across the CSME space in a seamless manner. We have the Caricom Public Procurement Notice Board, which is an online vehicle established to allow all procurement activities or procurement activities above what we refer to as a threshold, that those procurement activities could be made public and to allow Caricom nationals to bid to provide services. And that is the Caricom Public Procurement Notice Board, which is an online platform we've established to allow for that. We also have a labor market information system, which has also been redesigned and developed to give a sense of the movement of the status of labor in the CSME. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to draw that to your attention as professional engineers, that there are a number of online systems that have been developed and been redesigned to facilitate business in the community. And just before I end, we have produced in the Secretariat a very important piece of work in terms of a document which examines the whole single market and economy and looks at free movement, travel and work. The document is called Single Market and Economy, the Caricom Single Market and Economy, Free Movement and Work. It's online. I have put up the link that you could go on to find out more about all the procedures. I have only gone through some of them tonight. All the procedures that allow for free movement and the exercise of rights on free movement and work in the community can be found on this particular link. So let me thank you very much for your time this evening. I hope I did not go too far over time, Mr. Jones, and that your colleagues could bear patience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Preville, for your very interesting presentation. I think you shared with us this evening information that certainly needs to be in the public sphere and of which professionals need to be aware, because sometimes I think there's a lot of misunderstanding or basically non-knowledge of what is required and what rights we do have as Caricom nationals within the community. So at this stage, I want to open up for our discourse where we'll have some questions and be able to interact with Mr. Preville. Before we do that, I just want to acknowledge the presence of Mr. Salas Hamilton. Salas was kind enough to help to arrange this evening in terms of getting Mr. Preville on board, and he is the Caricom Secretariat's person in specialist communications. And I also want to acknowledge two of our fellows who are here, in Mr. Engineer Andrew Hutchinson and our President, Colonel Trevor Brown. So one of the questions, or the very first question out of the box, was from Valerie Kelsick. And she pretty much had asked something that you mentioned coming on to the end there, which is, does CSME envision harmonization of bona fides, professional certifications, required professional registrations, or does the vetting of qualifications lie solely with the employer of the accepting state? I think you would have mentioned a little bit about that. Do you want to expand a bit on that, Mr. Preville?
Sure. And like you, let me just indicate also, you mentioned Salas. On the program this evening, I have some colleagues from the CSME unit. We have our Assistant General Counsel, Gladys Young, who has been with the Secretariat for a while and very knowledgeable. So we wanted to ensure we have sound legal advice to share with you and your team tonight on the CSME. I have with me also Mr. Philip McLaurin, who is a Senior Technical Officer responsible for coordinating work under the 11th EDF, under which a lot of the online systems would have been developed and operating. I have Wanya Ellis, who is a Senior Technical Officer responsible for a number of areas, including and have oversight over free movement. So I thought, and we have Deborah Carrington with us. She is our Free Movement and Labor Officer. So I thought we would have brought on board a number of persons to give you support, to give me support and to give you advice as and very importantly, towards the end, I indicated that the Secretariat is working towards the whole area of treating with registration and licensing. And I have Timothy Odell, who is the Deputy Program Manager responsible for services. He's on also. So I will answer, but the colleagues are free to join in. And the question you asked had to do with the area of
harmonization of bona fides, professional certification, and the requirement for professional registrations in the various member states. Excellent.
And this is really where we have been focused, or the attention is being turned to now. And we have a single economic space, but we recognize that Caricom is made up of a number of sovereign countries. And for the purpose of tonight's discussion, we're looking at engineers, for argument's sake. So we recognize that pretty much every member state has some professional engineers association, and most of them, those engineers association, are actually in law. And while an engineer would have obtained his qualifications or certification from any university anywhere in the world, and would have and could be a professional engineer, when it comes to the act of practicing in a member state, this is where we see the specific licensing arrangements coming up. And those are, I understand, and the engineers on the call can guide, these are meant to ensure a number of things. Those licenses are meant to ensure that in a number of instances that engineers stay on top of the game. So there are a number of courses you have to undertake every year to receive your continuous license that obtains in a medical profession. So there's also the issue of standards to ensure that certain standards are maintained. Licensing is also in practice in member states, so that an engineer who perhaps would have done something outside of what should be done normally, that his license could be revoked for the protection of the body politic, professional engineers, but also the consumer of the services from that engineer. So we are thinking at the Secretariat that it might be beneficial to work with perhaps the engineers, for instance, to explore the possibility of a common registration system. And this would be separate and apart from a common licensing system, because licensing may be at the national level for the purposes I identified and more, but the registration component could be treated with. So once an engineer is registered with the Barbados Professional Engineers Association, that person is an engineer, is an engineer. As to whether the person will practice as an engineer depends on him or her being licensed at any one time in any one of the member states. So we are thinking of harmonization, at least at the level of registration. So we perhaps will have a single space, online platform, where every one of those member states, individual associations could be put on board, in that space. These are our registered engineers in country X or country Y or country Z. So these people need not present themselves again, except for the licensing purposes.
That's a fantastic initiative. And I want to invite Colonel Brown, who wears several hats apart from the president of the Barbados Association of Professional Engineers. He's also responsible for the Caricom, or the Caribbean Engineers Association. So Colonel Brown, could you join us here and perhaps engage a bit on your thoughts pertaining to this regional registration process and how we could possibly push this ahead, sir?
Good night, everyone. Thank you, Vincent. Well, actually, I'm quite happy to listen for a while. We are very much on board with what the speaker has said. I'm a little bit surprised because at least 2 years ago, I think, coming through the national standards organizations in the region and cross-Q. A very similar initiative was actually initiated by CCAO, which is the Council of Caribbean Engineering Organizations. And it is actually the intent is surprisingly similar to those expressed by Mr. Preville. So we seem to be very, very much on board. So I'm actually quite happy to listen to see, how far we've actually reached and was the chance of bringing that to fruition fairly shortly.
Excellent. If you don't mind, I can ask Timothy Odell, who is on. I don't know, Timothy, if you want to, in 1 minute, give the engineers a sense as to where we are with respect to the registration element. I think I saw Timothy. Yes.
Yes, thanks, Preville. And thanks to Vincent and other engineers. Now, there is a regional policy which was approved by all of our member states, the Quartet, in 2013, and I think that should be made available to all of the engineers in Barbados and across the community. It is available at within member states, but as Titus, well, I prefer to call him Titus.
Titus,
as Mr. Preville is saying, given that we have a single space for our engineers, the Quartet, which is the ministers responsible for trade, approved on the 8th of March this year a draft framework which, one, separates registration from licensing, and the registration, like the birth certificate, is a one-time act. Once you have your birth certificate as Vincent Jones, you move around as Vincent Jones. There's no need to change to Titus or Leo Preville or Timothy Odell. So your registration is fixed. And on that basis, we are going now to ensure that the requirements and the procedures for registration are the same across all of the member states. And so once you are registered in Barbados, and Barbados is a segment of our single space, you would be deemed to have registered across the community. And we are now going through the mechanics. We have to streamline what happens in Barbados, where my understanding is that the person who is registering applies to BAPE. BAPE goes through checking that the person is who they say they are as an engineer, and then issues a letter for that person to take to the registrar of the Supreme Court to be registered as an engineer. Now, all of that is to be streamlined. And Barbados should have had these discussions now for some time, because the idea is for the registrar to cede that function and give that function now to the regulators of the engineers, which is the Engineers Registration Board. And it will be the Engineers Registration Board that issues now the certificate of registration for that engineer who would work in Barbados. And that will be the case of in each member state, there will be a similar arrangement. And that would then evolve to a stage where the certificate, the registration certificate issued by Barbados is, we will simplify it just like a driver's license with barcodes and the emblem of engineers. Like the lawyers have the scale of justice. The engineers, we hope you have an emblem, but each engineer that is registered will have that emblem, a card with that emblem, with a barcode and so forth, that they pull it out and just show it on entry when they move around. And that would facilitate, and that would create no value in our single space, where once you are registered in Barbados, you are registered in the single space for engineers within our single space. And the ministers have approved it, and we are hoping to get this operational before year end. And there will be consultations and webinars and so forth to make sure that we bring you on board, we get your inputs as to how then to operationalize that decision. And so I look forward to working with Vincent, and I think I know the representative who was also with the CCEO, because we started this work with the engineering regional body some time back. But the fruits, the tree has blossomed, and the fruits are now ripening for harvest. I think that's the stage that we are at. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Odul. I think that's very exciting news for all persons here, not only engineers, we also have some architects within this meeting as well, and generally for professionals alike. It's very exciting news. Colonel Brown, you want to add anything based on that information that we've just learned?
Well, not really, Vincent. It is actually quite exciting to me too. It is a little bit more complicated and I'm looking forward to the kind of workshop situation where we can actually discuss. And I'm actually excited to hear that we're going to have some fairly intense discussions on this. It is a little bit more complicated because legally in the 15 different countries, there are different standards by which the registration bodies determine who is an engineer or who is not. And the real challenge is in harmonizing those standards. So that, for example, in Trinidad, the criteria to be considered and to be registered as a professional engineer by the registration body in Trinidad is different to what exists in Jamaica, and that is different to what exists in Barbados. And therefore, there is a technical challenge in actually harmonizing that. So it isn't just a simple matter of being registered in Barbados. But we're fully on board with the intent. I mean, this is exactly where we want to go, and it's just a matter of deciding on the technical issues and actually having those resolved. And probably most importantly, getting the buy-in from the various different countries and the legal changes that will be required to make this work. But in terms of the vision outlined by Mr. Preville and explained by Mr. Odul, we are fully on board. We are 100% on board with the overall vision. And the challenge is the technicalities and actually getting to that vision, and the possibility of, I mean, I'm excited about the possibility that we can possibly do it in a year or so. That really would be wonderful.
Fantastic. We have a question coming from our fellow Andrew Hutchinson. But Andrew, before I come to you, just a minute, you had mentioned, Mr. Preville, that the Ms. Young, I believe, is your legal advice person. So Ms. Young, could you perhaps, given Colonel Brown's comments just now about bringing legislation in the various states into line, could you perhaps shed some light in that regard? I mean, that sounds like a serious challenge. So from the perspective of the Secretariat, how quickly do you see those type of things being able to be realistically turned around regionally? Sorry, Ms. Young, you've unmuted, but we're not hearing you. I hope I haven't put you on the spot. For some reason, we are not hearing you if you're trying to speak. So what I'll do, I'll go to Engineer Hutchinson and we'll come back to you, Ms. Young. Hopefully you'll be able to shed some light in that regard. So Andrew, over to you, sir. Can I answer your question?
Thank you, Vincent. Very interesting presentation, and let me start by saying that I have practiced as an engineer for 50 years. across the Caribbean. In practically every Caribbean island, I've done a project. And so I can speak with some experience of the challenges which I have faced and which engineers face in working across the Caribbean, right across the Caribbean. And I listened to the presentation, and I must admit, I don't envy the individuals. This is a tremendous challenge. As I said, we out of Barbados, I had my own company, and then I teamed up with a bigger company. But we have bid projects across the Caribbean, and in reality, the funding agencies set the terms because they're putting out the money, and what is the old saying is still true: who pays the piper calls the tune. So you have a situation where RFPs, requests for proposals, come out, by and large, the terms of reference, but it's all essentially driven by the guy who the funding agency who is funding the project, and therefore the evaluation of your submission, and although the evaluations are done by the technical people in each island, they still have to conform with the requirements of the funding agency. So by and large, whether you're acceptable or not depends on your CV and your track record and so forth. And I'm not even sure in many instances if you're a licensed professional engineer in the Caribbean actually matters. So it is what you're trying to do is an extremely complicated project. And I support Trevor Brown just now in his initial comments. I want to suggest that it is far more complicated than Leo Preville and his team at the Caricom CSME think that it is. I am currently on the registration board in Barbados. I've been on it before. I've been recycled now, and yeah, Trevor is right. I'm registered in St. Lucia and Barbados, and but the acts that I have read, everyone is slightly different. So to bring a commonality or a common approach to that is going to be extremely challenging. Some islands, St. Lucia has a registration. St. Vincent, to my knowledge, does not. Grenada does not. So there's a mixed bag of some have acts, some don't have acts, etc. And as you said, the biggest challenge is that they're all sovereign states. So how in the name of heavens you're going to get 15 or 20 sovereign states to come to commonality or a common agreement, a common approach in a matter like this? I don't envy you. I think it's an enormous challenge, which I don't think I'll see in my lifetime. But there's some other, one of the things we find very annoying. When you bid projects in these islands, there's always something called withholding tax, and it varies from island to island. Now, I understand the reason for it. They're going to get their pound of flesh. But what I've seen happen recently in some of the islands, and each island has a different number and a different scheme and a different way of doing it. So, but what I've seen recently is that if you bid the job and they like your proposal, they then ask you to compute the withholding tax separately, and but you don't have to pay it. The government will pay it on your behalf. So, but that's not so in each island. It varies. But they're sovereign states, so I guess they're entitled to lay the playing field how they see fit. My friend, I don't envy you at all. I think you're it would be wonderful if we could get some common recognition of engineers, of the licensing of engineers. You made a point to distinguish between registration of engineers and licensing of engineers, and I'm not sure I fully understand the difference, because it seems like semantics to me. If you're registered, but then you're not licensed, what's the point? I don't know. I didn't quite grab that idea. Anyhow, let's stop for now. I think my friend, you have my sympathy.
All right, thanks, Andrew. Mr. Preville, if you could probably elaborate a bit on what is the difference in concept between the licensing and the registration. And I don't know if Ms. Young, she's put some information in chat, but I don't know, Ms. Young, if you want to try to engage again, perhaps you can offer a legal point of view on some of these matters that have been mentioned.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Good evening,
Okay.
ma'am.
Good evening, and thanks again. I was just indicating that at the end of the day, yes, they are sovereign states that would have to enact legislation. Once legislation is required, member states would have to enact the legislation. But it's important to remember the legal landscape. So while member states and at the national level, the national laws would apply, the revised treaty and community law applies at community level. And frankly, even at the domestic level, to the extent that the revised treaty has been incorporated into the laws of all of our member states that are party to the treaty. So the legislative landscape is there to allow for persons to challenge where necessary, and to mount that challenge both at the national level and at the Caribbean Court of Justice. So the question as to how we would seek to harmonize, we do have a process to do community model laws to assist member states in their enactment of domestic legislation, but at the end of the day, it's Parliament that makes law in each country. And so we have seen cases where parliaments have made changes to what have been proposed as models. That said, it is important, that said, at the end of the day, once you are aware of the provisions, once you are aware of the steps that the community is taking and the community decisions, which the community is making efforts to publish, and quite a few of the community decisions are already published on the Caricom website, and the step is for all of those decisions to be published on the Caricom website. But once engineers are aware and other professionals, then you would be able to challenge both domestically and regionally. What I'm not understanding is, I understand the point being made that that various countries have different regulations. It's confusing to someone who is a layperson in the context of the engineering profession, in the sense that we have a common university that produces the engineers. So why is it that we have so many different engineering requirements in the different member states? And one of the decisions that the conference has made and that we should be moving towards is simplifying the requirements for movement and simplifying administrative procedures. And so to the extent that certainly at the engineering level, we should only be requiring those processes, those requirements that are necessary to ensure that you are keeping a particular standard.
Thanks very much, Ms. Young, for that engagement. Mr. Preville, do you want to shed some light on the concept or thought behind the differences between the registration aspect and the licensing that was mentioned?
Yeah, very simply, again, a registered engineer is someone, I would perhaps move from the engineering and just take the medical profession. A doctor is a doctor. once he has been determined to be a doctor by virtue of the qualifications he's acquired from a university that has met the accreditation standards accepted in a country. So a medical doctor is able to move from Barbados and practice medicine in St. Lucia. However, the question for him to practice medicine in St. Lucia would be, yes, you are a doctor, and we're not disputing your title of doctor. So you are a doctor, a physician. However, to practice medicine, you've got to be registered with the Medical and Dental Association in St. Lucia. Why is that? Why registered? Why not just go and practice in the community? Well, you cannot just go and practice in the community, because if something goes wrong in your practice, how are you brought to, how are you managed, how are you disciplined? Who says that, yes, we verified that this person was bona fide? That's where the licensing issue comes in. And I suspect the same thing would apply for the engineers. So the engineers normally have the licensing arrangement to ensure that the engineers meet continuously certain standards of operation. So you got your degree in 1960. As an engineer, you now have a lot of experience. Yes, we're not disputing that, but things have changed. Technology has changed. And are you keeping on top of the new technology that you are using? And that is why you ought to do a number of hours in doing certain courses. So that is where the licensing, the renewal of your license comes into the picture every year. So that, I hope that gives you a sense as to the difference between the registration and the licensing.
Okay, I think because in the Barbadian context, there's some overlap in what you're speaking about. I think that's probably where the persons who are Barbadian registered engineers may be a little confused in when you say licensing versus registration, because there's a bit of an overlap there here. I'm going to permit Colonel Brown to have some engagement, and then we will go to Mr. Guerrero. Colonel Brown?
No, I'm quite happy to let Wilfredo go first.
Okay. All right, Mr. Guerrero, you're up next, sir. Mr. Wilfredo Guerrero, I invite you to unmute and ask your question. I'm not sure if he stepped away for a moment, Colonel Brown, so you better go off and then we'll invite him again.
Okay, fine. Well, maybe I should turn my camera on too. So basically, we're fully on board with the president. A very good presentation. You basically said all the things that we were hoping you would say, sir. And we're fully on board with the vision that you've actually articulated. The problem, I think, as Engineer Hutchinson outlined, is that this is something we have been actively working on in the engineering profession regionally for decades. Decades, I mean with a D. And the problem that so let me explain a couple of things. First of all, the whole question of registration of engineers, just like medicine and the other professions that you mentioned, is global. So you have to understand that this is not just an issue of Barbados and the region. There's also the question, for example, of the free trade with the European Union, for example, that discussion that is currently ongoing. And the whole question of who then is determined to be an engineer eligible to operate in a given space as that professional. Now, the problem is, as the lawyer explained, in each territory, the law is different. Now, and somebody said that the solution is to have a model. We actually did have a Caricom model. And that model was used to create the laws in the various territories, which all turned out to be different and has been a problem. So models did not solve the problem. Why I would like to toss out, though, is how the latest iteration that we have proposed at the Caribbean level in engineering to address the problem. And to summarize it, and I do understand the terms you're using in terms of licensing and registration, so that each country has the legal right to register who they want to consider to be engineers in that territory. That cannot be changed. We tried changing that for the last 20 years. We've made zero movement. What we have proposed recently through the National Standards Institute and through CrossQ, and we're hoping that this will find its way up to your secretariat, sir, to your desk, is an arrangement where what we do is institute a regional certification so that the individual territorial registration remains. So Barbados is free under Barbados law to determine who is an engineer in Barbados. Belize will continue to do the same thing, Trinidad and Jamaica. But we are proposing the creation of a Caricom level registration that registration once, and each territory will be given will actually have the right to give that designation too. So the Barbados registration, we're not going to create a new registration authority. The Barbados Registration Board, the Trinidad Registration Board, the Belize Registration Board will continue to be registering. But once they establish that the applicant has met the Caricom registration level, they will register the person at the Caricom level, which we will designate some term to recognize that. And that person will then be the person that enjoys the right to operate freely in any territory. Meanwhile, any person registered by the Barbados Authority can register in Barbados as is always and in conformity to their law. Similarly in Trinidad, in Jamaica, in Belize. But it solves the problem of the regional movement and it also solves the other problem of allowing us now to create a level of professional at the regional level that puts us in a position to compete at the international level. We were very concerned, for example, at the advanced negotiations you have with the free movement of trade between the Caribbean and the European Union. And that includes engineering services. And to the extent that we have not a clearly defined level of registration for professional engineers from the region's point of view, put us at a clear disadvantage. So our proposal is that we put something in place to solve that problem and at the same time solve the problem of free movement throughout the region. The response that we've had from the the registration bodies, the various registration bodies, they interviewed the various engineering bodies and got feedback. And my understanding is that that has been very positive. We've also had very good response from CrossQ, because what we're aiming to do is to establish this as a regional standard that would then be accepted by your office and be approved by COTED. So that is the approach that we've actually attempted to take, and it is out of due respect for the difficulty in changing the laws in any one territory, far less trying to do it in 10 territories in a short time frame. So that essentially is where we are as we speak.
Mr. Preville, would you like to respond?
So this is very interesting and very exciting, actually, because I like the creativity in coming up with this sort of standard that would become the definition, as it almost were, for movement of engineers. So if an engineer wants to move throughout the region and practice seamlessly, they meet this particular agreed upon standard, and that allows for movement. That's interesting. I don't know if this would, I guess once laws are passed that make it legal, it becomes legal. I don't know if Gladys, Ms. Young has any comment on that in terms of, I'm thinking in my mind of this, any form of discrimination here. But legally, if it is something that is agreed upon by all, it sounds like it begins to solve the problem to allow for at least a group of engineers to move. The challenge, I believe, would be, and it only become a challenge if an engineer who has not met that Caricom certification standard feels that he's been discriminated against for some reason. So that perhaps is where you might have a challenge. But I turn to Gladys in terms of Ms. Young, in terms of any perceived legal challenge we would have with this. That is?
Just very briefly before she does, and this is my closing point on that, is that this was we consider that to the extent that an engineer does not meet the standard set for the regional qualification, puts them in exactly the same position they are now, where they would then have to qualify in each individual territory in which they have to operate, which is exactly what Engineer Hutchinson had to do and would have to do if he wanted to do it tomorrow. So there's nothing to lose. There's also no need for any changes in the law whatsoever, because what we'll be doing is creating a new entity that really did not exist in the past, and that does not contravene any of the laws. It actually sits on top of everything that we have at present. So we actually spent a lot of time trying to come up with something that could actually work. And actually, the only problem we saw is if your office didn't like it, if it was not accepted at the quoted level. But once it is approved by CrossQ as a regional standard and accepted at quoted, to be quite honest, we actually see it as a win-win situation.
I see it as a win-win situation. In fact, the engineer has two bites at the cherry. He can choose to remain in his own place and go country by country, or he could just simply go one step level higher and is accepted throughout. Okay, I get you. Yes.
Ms. Young, you want to shed some light there?
I would have to see the written proposal. I see some flags that would need to be addressed in terms of, one, what is being proposed in terms of a regional registration would still require legislative action at the national level. So I understand what the point that is or what is trying to be achieved, but we would need to see if it could actually be achieved, because you would still need to have that legislative change at the national level to recognize that regional registration in each member state. And there would also be I would say I would leave it at that for the moment, and I would leave it at that for the moment and come back at a later date once we're able to see the written proposal.
Thanks very much for that, Ms. Young. So Andrew, before I come to you, I know Mr. Wilfredo Guerrero had his hand up earlier. Mr. Guerrero, are you there now? Would you like to answer your question? Wilfredo, are you there? Can you hear me? You're muted if you're trying to speak. Okay. All right, Andrew, go ahead with your question, please.
Well,
sorry. Hold on, Andrew. Sorry. Yes, Mr.
Go ahead.
Guerrero.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I just want to say that we in Belize, we don't have any problem with anybody coming here to work, provided they can meet our registration standards. And our registration standard includes continuous education. So if anybody from Caricom wants to come and work in Belize, just have to apply for a temporary registration to our association. And likewise, we would expect that if anybody wants to go to, let's say, St. Vincent or St. Lucia or Barbados or Trinidad, that they can do the same, complying with what the country wants, need standards. That's all I want to say, but we are open to people coming in from the Caribbean, from Caricom, and just that they have to meet our standards. And we have standards set by Professional Engineering Board, Board of Professional Engineering Education, and that is administered by the Admissions Committee. And if you can meet that, well, you're welcome. No problem.
Okay, Mr. Wilfredo Guerrero, thank you. And it's great to know that we've got a nice mix of persons from the north of the Caribbean as well. I have a friend, actually a family member, who is also online from St. Martin. So it's good to see that we've got the region in this forum this evening so that we can really have a regional flavor for what we are discussing. So Andrew, I'll permit you to ask your question now, and I would crave your thoughts on something that was mentioned earlier of the possibility of removing the aspect of the registration process from the Supreme Court and putting that on the Engineers Registration Board. So I'd ask you to offer some comment in that regard, along with the comments you're going to make otherwise.
Okay, Vincent, I just want to comment on what my colleague, President Brown, mentioned. And his ideas is a great idea to try to have a Caricom recognition of professional engineers, or Caricom standard for. But you know, I'm not trying to be negative, but your attorney there, Gladys Young, mentioned it. That will come to zero unless you can get all the Caricom states to agree to recognize that qualification. Because if CSME Caricom sets up such a umbrella recognition, but then each state says, well, we still don't agree with that. You still have to do your own thing to practice in wherever, you know, which island. So I think, and that has always been the problem of Caricom. How do you get agreement among Caricom states on matters like this? It just appears to be a common talking point, and it's obviously a huge challenge politically as well. But it's a great idea. I like the idea, and maybe we should just go ahead and do it. But I think the value of it will only be realized if CARICOM countries agree to recognize it. Otherwise, it's pointless. The other thing I want to mention is that I've noticed, I will call you country, but in some countries, the registration process, I think, is a bit discriminatory. I think wherever you come from in the world, you're entitled to apply in any particular country in the Caribbean to be registered and be evaluated and be registered. There should be no discrimination, but there's a practice in some islands where expat firms coming in to do work there are required to hire a local registered engineer who will then have to certify all of their drawings. It's like, I mean, you know, instead of asking the engineers from abroad to register and comply with the local law, it works in the way that they have to align themselves with a local registered engineer, so he can stamp the drawings for a fee. I don't think that's the correct way to do it. That is almost what the word, not extortion, but something like that. But that practice is crept in I will call the island and a few islands. So back to your point though, Vincent, we had a registration act in Barbados since 1975. I think we were one of the first. And it has gone like that for many years, where the registration board evaluates submissions and approves registration or not, and then informs the registrar of the court, and the registrar of the court then receives, you have to go in and pay your registration fee, and then you get a certificate of registration. Now that's done annually. But we found that that is not necessarily the most efficient mechanism, regulatory process. The registrar is supposed to publish every year by February all those who have paid up and are current. But sometimes that list in the Gazette doesn't come out till, I don't know, later in the year, July, August. So I certainly think that the registration board should be given more autonomy, more authority to manage the process. The registration board in Barbados is the legal statutory authority set up to regulate the engineering profession. And that board should have the authority to when you issue registration, to issue stamps to engineers or seals, and if necessary, to receive your fee, receive your annual fee and issue your certificate. I think the challenge here is that the registrar and the political directorate still sees the registration of engineers as a tax collection measure. So you register as an engineer and then you got to pay, and I think it's $1,500 now. So that really is as a tax, but you can still get your tax, but I think it would be far more efficiently done if the Engineers Registration Board, as it's called in Barbados, is allowed to function in that way. I think it'd be a lot more efficient than having current practice that now happens. Anyhow, that's
pretty much, Andrew, that's what was being suggested in an effort to streamline the whole activity, certainly to remove that extra step and place that responsibility firmly in the ERB's court, as it were. Mr. Odell, I see you've raised your hand, so I think you have some burning issue you want to exchange with us. Please do engage.
Yes, thanks. See, just to flag that there is a regional policy. There is a regional policy that we would harmonize the framework, including the legislation. And as Mr. Hutchinson said, Engineer Hutchinson, what we will seek to do is to have legislation that would enable those member states that currently don't regulate engineers to do so. And when they come on board, the legislation would all speak to like common elements, such as the separation of the association from the regulator, giving the powers and the function to the regulator to regulate engineers. The mere fact that Quartet has signed off on this policy, it therefore means now that the type of administrative changes we would seek to engage member states that sign off at the policy level to actually now start the administrative changes, including having discussions in the case of Barbados, because that is not the case elsewhere in other countries, but in the case where the registrar is the person who issues the registration certificate. All of those consultations will take place, given that there is no community policy to facilitate this single registration of engineers. And I would just like Trevor and all the others who, if they could at least share with us the information, the proposals that they have with respect to this Caricom standard and so forth, because we need to be on the same track. We want to have a common vision, and we need to have results that we can realize as soon as possible. So the first step is to now start focusing on closing the informational gaps and working together so that the quartet that has approved the framework would, when it meets again, the specific proposals for engineers can now incorporate the work that was being done with the CCEO, CrossQ, and so forth, to run in tandem now with our proposal for the single space for engineering services. And as I said, we will have webinars, and I look forward to further discussions and so forth with the Barbados group as well as the regional groups. Thanks.
Okay, Colonel Brown.
Okay, yes, just a couple of very, very brief points. First of all, thank you very, very much for that, Mr. Odell. I can assure you that I'm going to make sure that you actually have in your hands the most current proposals that we have, and I'll try to establish how far we've got level across Q. But I just want to touch on 3 quick points, just to clarify some questions I've seen on the site. First of all, from Belly's point of view, while I fully understand the sentiment that you've expressed about, that anyone who meets your qualification is welcome to come and work. This was always the situation, but you have to understand that we now live in a new reality where at the quartet level, at the regional heads level, it has been decided that there will be free movement. And basically what we're trying to do is to come up with a mechanism that will make that as seamless and as professional as possible. So it really is not a matter of trying to hang on to what we always had, where we set our own individual standards. What we're trying to do is to make sure that the standards that are imposed are acceptable to all. The other thing I want to make clear is that what we're proposing at the regional level, there are no legal issues at all, because what we have deliberately decided to do it through the existing legal framework, so that in each of the 15 countries, or the countries that have registration boards or board of engineering, as they're called in Trinidad, for example, that is going to be the legal body that will actually issue the registration. What they will be doing is doing it against a standard that has been accepted and certified at the quartet level. So basically what we're trying to, the current process is getting cross-Q buying to the standard that we have set and said, these are the things that you will need to do in order to be certified. If we get quartet to buy into that, then the regional engineering bodies will have a standard to look at. Right now, there are 15 different standards that are being used that have been developed by the laws in the 15 countries. What this will do is give them another standard to look at, say, this is the standard that you can use to determine that this person is a Caricom engineer, for example. It does not take away from anything that currently exists or any restrictions that currently exist and all that. All it does is create a new level agreed by quartet that solves the problem of free movement and establishes a level that we can use regionally when we discuss with international partners in terms of engineering and movement of services and all that. The other thing I want to touch on that Andrew touched on briefly is the whole question of the requirement in some countries that local engineers be used to sign off on documents. And I think this is actually an attempt to ensure that there's a transfer of technology and transfer of knowledge when high-level services, and especially in the absence of the kind of standards that we're trying to do now. We've had a situation where this kind of knowledge level has been dominated by external forces. And basically some countries have taken the decision that we need to make sure that some of this knowledge remains local, and that may be the approach that they're taking. What I'm hoping is that with the new free movement of services, that the approach now will be to encourage an upliftment of the standard so that everyone aims to be a Caricom engineer rather than settling for what we may have accepted for the last 20 or 30 years. These standards have been changing at the global level. There's a Washington Accord that establishes global standards for engineering registration, and we need to be on board with that. Otherwise, we'll be competing against the EU, for example, who are using higher standards. So we need to come on board, and I'm extremely happy that we seem to be saying the same things. A little bit disappointed that we're not looking at the same documents, but I'll make sure that is problem to solve very, very shortly by sharing those documents with you with your office. So those are the points I just want to make based on some of the comments I saw.
Thanks, Colonel. Before we come to you, Andrew, I just want to read a comment that's come from Mr. Winston Mellows. I believe this is Mr. Mellows from UWI St. Augustine. He said, we have a different problem at the present time. The BOETT, I'm not sure what that means, but probably someone can shed some light, handles the full process.
That's the Board of Engineering of Trinidad and Tobago, Registration Board.
Thanks very much, Andrew. They handle the full process of registering engineers, obviously in Trinidad and Tobago. He said the judiciary currently does not enter into the equation. The board has been active in making registration as an engineer compulsory. So he makes a comment there that we are getting there. So I think it's very encouraging that basically, Mr. Preville, everyone wants to get to that apex. It's just a case of everyone now pointing their ships in the same direction and sailing in the same direction, more or less. So I do trust that through tonight's engagement, we have highlighted some information that perhaps one side didn't know that the other side was doing, and that we, as Colonel Brown said, will be in a position to share that information to help this process to go forward as smoothly and quickly as possible. What are your thoughts on that, Mr. Preville?
I'm very excited by the sharing from Mr. Brown, Engineer Brown here. Especially, he made mention of a very important dimension of having that standard that he speaks to that will be established. Our capacity as a region to engage with entities beyond the Caricom. So we have what we call a EU Cariforum EPA. And the question is, the EU does not want to engage with one member state by member state. They want to engage with the Cariforum region, in this case, Caricom plus the Dominican Republic. Now, the question is, if we have a common standard for an engineer, we could say when a Caricom engineer is seeking to provide services to the EU, there is one standard that the EU is looking to, as opposed to trying to work through who is an engineer in Trinidad, who's an engineer in Grenada. So I think that approach actually helps treat with our own national, I call national meaning our Caricom arrangements, but it places us in a much better position to take advantage of arrangements, bilateral arrangements outside of ourselves, say with the Europeans and with the British, for which we have right now established a Caricom or Cariforum UK Economic Partnership Agreement.
Fantastic. Andrew?
Yeah, just a final comment. Let me just say that I'm pleased, excited about the fact that we're having this discussion and it is even being discussed. Because, you know, as a small island, series of small island developing states, the Caribbean, we, in our little domain here, we have, you know, especially with engineers coming to work in the Caribbean, many of them coming from outside don't appreciate, maybe don't even respect the fact that you need to register and have some respect for the law of Barbados or wherever, Trinidad, that says you got to be a licensed engineer practice here. Many of them don't seem to understand, but you know, the reverse is true. None of us in the Caribbean islands can just walk into the US and practice, or, you know, Canada, or they have their regulations, but they don't understand when they come into our domain why they need to comply with our regulations. And I think that is unfortunate. But let me just finish by saying I am very happy and elated that we've had this workshop, because you're actually discussing a very important subject. How do we fix the problem?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, for that. And I think we're all basically on board with the mindset that it is a challenge that I would think Mr. Preville and his team are actively engaged in trying to resolve for the benefit of Caricom. Now, Mr. Preville, I know we're a little over time, and I ask everybody's grace on that, but given the importance of what we're discussing, I'm sure that everyone would have a bit of time for what we're doing here this evening. There are a couple of questions I would like to ask before we break this evening. The first one is, do the rights under Articles 36 and 37 extend to the 5 associate members?
No, they do not.
Okay. So in terms of those countries who are associate members, then would they just they will have to go through the individual regulatory process in each place that they're going to set up business? Correct.
And put it this way, we will not have automatic rights into their jurisdiction either. So their members or persons from their country cannot exercise a right in our member states. So whatever our member states offer is totally at our discretion towards them, as opposed to them having a right. That's the subtle difference.
Okay. Post the COVID experience that we have just gone through, how much of the being able to register and set up your business in another territory can be done without physically having to travel there, if you look at it from a regional picture?
And that is the I mentioned earlier on, we had work done on the online companies registry system. And the lessons that COVID taught us was that a lot of what we were doing manually before can actually be done online. So we are actively engaged in a program now of doing two things. One, the whole area of harmonization of business law. And Ms. Young would, well, she is heading that project right now. Looking at, we have a consultancy going around looking at how we could harmonize our legislation so that the process of establishing a business in St. Lucia is the same as in Barbados, is the same as in Trinidad, the same as in Guyana. The way you treat with insolvency is the same. The way you register a business name is the same. So once we have established the commonality of law, you have a very good basis now to have an online system for registering and incorporating a business. So it all begins with having this common basis, the legal basis. And once you have that, the online component can feed in. Because we do have an online component right now, which was meant to allow the registrars of companies in our individual member states to literally register their businesses at a central location. But what happened in the end was that most of the member states have standalone online registration systems. And what we're now looking at doing is possibly looking at how can we take the information from each of those standalone systems and have it reside in a common pool that would be a Caricom pool, so to speak. So yes, the registration, online registration throughout the Caribbean is something we should be aiming for. We are aiming for it, but at this point, we're not yet there.
It sounds like we need to have another Cricket World Cup and some sunset legislation across the region to get things moving.
I would hope the engineers would be calling as we are about to celebrate the 50th year of Caricom next year. It would be good to have the engineers calling in their own right for that type of free movement on the leaders of Caricom. And perhaps it's the voices from below that is going to give the political directorate the nudge to have us to move freely in the region as we always intended to.
Yes, I mean, I've been told, Andrew, no thing on you, but I think you are a tad older than I am. And I've been told by my grandparents that it was actually easier to move around the region post-independence than it became after independence in terms of being able to work. So that is something I think we all need to clamor for. All right, my next question to you, sir, before we close this evening. Is there an established timeline as to an average as to how long it takes a Caricom national to be able to establish a commercial presence in a member state?
It all depends on the member state procedures, which is exactly what the challenge is right now. It's the harmonization of all of those procedures that would give us predictability in the system. Each member state has its own set of procedures. I know it should not take more than, in terms of incorporation, it shouldn't take more than 5 days in some countries. But the steps are not the same in every member state. And that is what the challenge is. I don't know if Gladys, Ms. Young has any inputs or any of my colleagues on, but that is the challenge. The challenge is the procedures are not the same throughout.
We've constantly heard about the ease of doing business index and the challenges that present themselves for persons who actively want to set up business in particular Barbados, and the regulatory and the challenges that there exist, as opposed to going to other jurisdictions where they can turn things around so quickly. So I do hope that we are able to get those things lined up. I know government here has been talking about a one-stop shop, and I hope something like that will be reflective across the region so that persons who are looking to invest and set up in the region, because I think it is important that we start thinking regionally, are able to do that in the shortest time period and without the reams of red tape that seem to exist right now. Okay, any final questions from anyone before we close out this evening? Colonel Brown, I see you've unmuted.
Yeah, Vincent, I think it just quickly, is Mr. Odell's office at Sky Mall?
Mr. Odell is in Guyana, but if you have a document or something you want to drop off, we're in Sky Mall, we would be able to get it to him for sure.
Oh,
But
great. So thank you very much.
He is in Guyana, but that's not a problem.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Hamilton, I see you've shown us your young face, so I invite you to have some comments, sir.
Thank you ever so much, Vincent. I am very heartened by the engagement this evening. You would have reached out to me some months ago, and I think tonight is the fruit of the labor. I was going to say a lot more because I saw some gloom from Engineer Hutchinson, but finally he agreed that there was some hope. And that is all we have to focus on when we speak about regional integration. It's not for the faint-hearted. And he speaks of decades in trying to get this thing right. What we at the Caricom Secretariat have to do along with you is to push. And I would have seen some success stories over the years with the institutions that we have created and with the incremental steps that we have made. My colleague Titus Preville speaks about the 50 years that we're going to be celebrating come next July 2023. And if we really think back on those 50 years, we have made some strides. There is more to happen. And I can sense that this group would like to see CSME in its full elaboration, free movement of persons, free movement of goods, establishment, etc. And I think that is what we have to aim for. And even though the biggest challenge, and Engineer Hutchinson, I call his name most, because initially I was saying, oh my, he's the one I need to focus on. He speaks about the sovereign states. That is so true. But at the end of the day, I think once we can start the engagement and the discussion, we will have some successes. Thank you for the engagement. We are here at Sky Mall. I also know you're president in another capacity very well. And yourself, Vincent, you and I are friends. I think a second episode of this could be in the making. Not only St. Martin and Belize, but I think there's another colleague of yours from Suriname as well. So there is a full representation in some way of the region here. And for the Barbados Association of Professional Engineers, I want to thank you for having this discussion. And if we can have more, we'll be more than grateful. And that's what we're here for.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hamilton. I certainly will be reaching out to you, especially since you have a celebration year coming up. But certainly we can have some more engagements, because I think it is extremely important that the whole concept of Caricom be really forcibly preached to our people at this time. I think our people are getting anxious. They see other players around the world coming together. They see what is happening externally, and we all know that together we are stronger as opposed to several small little nations. And I think the impetus more now than ever is important for us to join together and to really pull down those barriers that are keeping us from being able to move between one another and to work harmoniously. So I think this is certainly a start. And I will engage with you, Salas, to see what other topics we can discuss to help push that process along. And certainly coming into next year, how we can engage with the Secretariat for to get that message out a bit more forcefully, not only here in Barbados, but through the regional conduit that we have as well. So thank you very much for that. Mr. Preville, I will offer you closing comments, sir.
Just to say that it would take entities such as the Barbados Association of Professional Engineers to work and lead with the other member state engineers associations to make the change that's necessary. We at the Secretariat, we serve member states. That's what we do. We serve member states. We provide guidance to member states. But at the end of the day, if the appetite is not with the member state, then we cannot impose. So we were looking for partners throughout the community, partners like your association, that when we share your voice with our voice, we can, have some sort of resounding harmonious sounds in the region. So I really want to thank the association. Thank you for the opportunity tonight for us to speak and for us to discuss. And hopefully, in the not too distant future, we could have another session where I would love to see all the associations of engineers on one call, where we could have that type of deep engagement and perhaps solve problems right there, because engineers are very smart people. I expect solutions to come out of difficulties.
Thank you very much, Mr. Preville, for that. And we will work to make sure that something like that happens sooner rather than later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and good night, colleagues.
Good night. So there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. We've had quite an informative session. I think we've established some important groundwork, and obviously we've noticed that there is work going on, and we're just going to try to pull everything in one direction to make things happen a bit more quickly, which I think is to everybody's benefit here. I just want to inform you of some upcoming information pertaining to the Barbados Association of Professional Engineers. At present, we have our current journal that is out, and I invite you to go onto our website and go onto the link, and you'll be able to access that information and avail yourself of the great work being done by some of our members. The name of the journal is The Engine Room, and this is the second issue for this year so far. And we invite you, members and guests alike, to go on to the Barbados Association of Professional Engineers website, and certainly you can have a look through that. I know the focus has been on hurricane preparedness, given that we're coming into that season, and this is something that affects us regionally. So please do make yourself aware. Coming up next week, we have a student-focused webinar. The title of this webinar is going to be, excuse me, East meets West, over the 12-hour time difference. We're going to be geared to enlightening students to the international study opportunities that exist. We'll be engaging with a colleague of mine, Mr. Kirk Cheklo, and he's a lecturer at the Institute of Institute of Technical Education in Singapore. So it will be an interesting intercourse, because when it is 6 o'clock, or sorry, when it's 6:30 evening time here, it will be 6:30 morning time there. So there is a 12-hour difference, but I'm really excited to be able to expose our students to mindset from across the other side of the world, so that persons can really look and see that there are many possibilities out there, and to encourage our youth to really reach for the stars, as it were. So thank you, colleagues. Remember, this is a CPD event, Continuous Professional Development, and that was mentioned somewhat just now in our discussions as well, that as professionals, we need to keep current and to keep on top of what is happening within our individual professions. So again, please reach out to our office to claim your CPD points. My thanks to Mr. Preville, my thanks to Mr. Hamilton for making tonight happen. Mr. Preville, I extend thanks to your colleagues, Mr. Odell, and the others who are there, and we do look forward to future engagement. I bid you all a good night. Please remember, if you want to see a copy of, a recording of what we've done here tonight, that should be up on our website within a week's time. So you can go onto the BAP website, and tonight's session will be there recorded for your viewing pleasure. Thank you very much, colleagues. A blessed good night to you all.
Good night, Vincent and all.